Hi, and welcome to episode 5 of the Western Canon podcast. I'm your host, Jordan Alexander Hill, and today we'll be talking about Greek tragedy and the Oresteia. Hi again, and welcome back to the Western Canon podcast. On this month's show, I want to give a brief introduction to Greek tragedy, and then I'll focus on a work of literature that is central to the Western canon, and that is really the foundational work in the genre of tragedy. We also have a fantastic guest this month, the prolific British classicist Edith Hall. She'll be discussing her book, Introducing the Ancient Greeks, and she'll help us understand a little bit about ancient Greek life in 5th century Athens. So she'll talk about history, and she'll talk about city Dionysia, and she'll also dive into chapter 5 of her book, which is about Athens in the 5th century, which Edith Hall thinks is really the pinnacle of Greek achievement. The ancient Greeks invented the theater. It was the ancient Greeks who gave birth to the idea of role-playing a part before a large audience, with trained actors reciting and singing written texts to musical accompaniment. The words that we take for granted, words such as tragedy, drama, and theater, these are all gifts that we receive from the ancient Greeks. So let's take a look at this word tragedy, which comes from tragoidia. Tragoidia originally meant a song, oid, performed in singing competitions in which the winner would take home a goat, tragos, tragoidia, which was a goat was a serious prize for someone who lived in an agricultural society, so that was kind of a big deal. Drama, on the other hand, meant something done, an action. A theater, theatron, was a place where one would go to view a drama, so that's why you have tragic drama. Words like tragedy and drama and theater have many meanings and connotations today. But in 5th century BC, they were connected to an annual festival in one particular place, the Great Dionysia in Athens. This was a sacred festival filled with feasts and delights that was devoted to the god Dionysus. If you go to our website, www.westerncanonpodcast.com, and go to the tab Links, we've posted resources that give you a sense of what this festival might have looked like and what the dramatic competitions held at this festival likely looked like. Some alliteration there, likely looked like. These dramatic competitions were held in the theater of Dionysus on the south slope of the Acropolis. And there's actually a reconstruction of what that looked like on the website. The Acropolis of Athens is an ancient citadel located on a rocky outcrop above the city of Athens. Pretty cool. It's important to note that these tragic dramas, which were composed and staged with actors and choruses and sets and props, these were of great cultural importance, so much so that they were funded at the public's expense, along with private contributions from the wealthiest citizens of Athens. Starting in the 4th century, theaters were constructed and dramas were staged throughout the Mediterranean world, wherever Greek was spoken. In fact, the Romans translated Greek dramas into Latin and used them as prototypes for the creation of their own new dramas, which in turn went on to inspire dramas throughout Europe and the rest of the Western world. One reason that Greek tragedies have been so impactful throughout the ages, you might say, throughout the Middle Ages to Shakespeare's time and into the modern age, into today, is that tragic dramas deal with universal aspects of the human condition, the most universal and unyielding aspects of who we are as human beings. Themes like suffering, despair, family conflict, the tension between public and private duty, the relationship between the sexes, the dangerous balance of political power, betrayal, revenge, war, and even positive remedies to some of these woes like justice, empathy, love, compassion, and really the search for meaning. Tragedies, perhaps above all else, I would say, help to remind the audience of the limits of human knowledge and accomplishment, and of the contrast between human understanding and that of the immortal gods. The tragedies serve to remind citizens not to count on retaining the gods' favor, and warn them not to suppose that they could understand forces beyond their control, forces that might be governing or dictating the course of their lives. So they were also humbling. For Athenians in the 5th century, these dramas were exhilarating to watch, even though many of these people, many of the citizens, already knew how the stories that they were watching would end. That's because many of the plots depicted in these tragedies were derived from stories first told in the Iliad and the Odyssey, of course, by Homer. Now, of course, to gain a basic understanding of Homer's great epics, you should go back and listen to episodes 2, 3, and 4 of this podcast. We spend the entirety of those episodes talking about Homer's Iliad and Homer's Odyssey. The Greek dramatists didn't seek to change the outcomes of the traditional myths, since these stories were a kind of history and also a cultural treasure for the ancient Greeks. The myths really were part of the ancient Greeks' identity. But the dramatists, as I think you'll see, poets like Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, they did alter and modify the narratives with new plot twists, new characters, and new story avenues. In this episode, for example, we'll look at Aeschylus's play, the Oresteia, which is the story of how Orestes, to avenge the death of his father Agamemnon, kills his mother Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus. A story that is later taken up by Sophocles in his drama Electra, as well as by Euripides in his play by the same name. Ancient audiences used these tragedies to understand their own lives and to express religious feeling. Rituals held in honor of Dionysus required worshippers to wear disguises, play roles, abandon routines, leave the safety of their homes, and go out into the wilderness. Okay? An interesting thing that we might want to note here is that over 1,000 tragedies were written in the 5th century BC. That's our best estimate. We have only 3% of these tragedies. All but 2 of the Greek tragedies that have survived were written by the following 3 tragedians. You have Aeschylus, who lived from 525 to 456 BC. He wrote 90 plays. Guess how many survived? Only 7 survived. You have Sophocles, who lived from 496 to 406 BC. He wrote 123 plays. Guess how many survived? Only 7. And you have Euripides. Euripides lived from 480 to 406 BC. He wrote 92 plays, and how many survived? 17 or 18 survived. So you get a sense of how little of this tradition we actually do understand. So making broad, sweeping claims about the tradition, the genre of Greek tragedy, making broad, sweeping claims about someone like Sophocles who wrote 123 plays, know that we're only commenting on 7 of 123 of his plays. So we don't fully understand how these poets evolved as artists. We don't fully understand the historical context that they interacted with. But I should touch on some historical events that did occur during the lives of these 3 playwrights. There was the Battle of Marathon, that was in 490 BC. You have the Second Persian War, that's 481 to 479 BC. You have the Peloponnesian War, 432 to 404 BC. Other events that you might think about are the death of Pericles, that happened in 429 BC, and also the death of Socrates in 399 BC. Socrates was put to death by the state. Now, because this is the Western Canon podcast and not a history podcast per se, we instead take a close-up look at the literature and the ideas and the politics of canonical works and the study of the classics. I do want to refer my listeners to some excellent podcasts that do look at the historical side of things. So if you're interested in learning more about Greek history, you should check out a podcast called The History of Ancient Greece. And I would point you to another podcast called Ancient Greece Declassified. I've actually spoken to the guy who does this show. It's very good, very well produced. He has conversations with prominent guests. It's a very well produced, engaging show. Unlike this podcast, Ancient Greece Declassified focuses solely on ancient Greece. So that's one resource that I would really recommend. Now, before we speak to the classicist Edith Hall, I'd like to say a little bit more about tragedy. Greek tragedy developed out of a polytheistic society, and as I mentioned, it's associated with the god Dionysus. So Dionysus is the god of irrationality and frenzy and madness, the fertility of plants, and obviously he's the god of wine. And this can be contrasted with the god Apollo, who is the god of reason, moderation, rationality, etc. This tension between the opposition of the Apollonian and Dionysian spirit, it is a subject of controversy among classics scholars. The Apollonian and Dionysian impulses were famously explored in Nietzsche's great work, The Birth of Tragedy. He published this in 1872. Nietzsche was actually a classicist. He was a philologist. Nietzsche identified the Apollonian as the spirit of measure, moderation, control. And the Dionysiac, on the other hand, corresponded to the loss of self, intoxication, excess, irrationality, and the union with the One. This was some sort of world soul. The Apollonian then underlays the plastic arts, and this is represented by sculpture, whereas the Dionysiac is represented by music, Nietzsche argued. Tragedy, then, if we want to better understand how this applies, can be seen as a conflict between the Dionysiac chorus — every Greek tragedy has a chorus — and the Apollonian characters in the tragedies. The Dionysiac, you might say, is constantly trying to break through the Apollonian. In Greek myth, you might want to know this, Dionysus' followers are seen as being possessed by, literally taken over by the god. Dionysus' female followers were called Maenads, and his male followers were called Satyrs. Now, I want to talk about the performance aspect of tragedy, the politics, the production, the stagecraft, a little bit of the cultural and historical context. We're going to bring Edith Hall on to do this. Tragedies took place at religious festivals for Dionysus. These ceremonies were not simply religious, but were civic in nature. And Dr. Hall is actually going to talk about that. She's going to discuss Greek history and 5th century Athens in general. And she details all of this in her book, Introducing the Ancient Greeks, which I've had the chance to spend the past week reading to my immense pleasure. She'll also discuss her love of the classics, the health of the discipline, her approach to studying history, and some of the politics surrounding the study of the classics right now, today. So let's introduce her. Edith Hall is one of Britain's foremost classicists. She earned her PhD from Oxford and has held posts at Cambridge, Oxford, Durham, and London universities. She now teaches at King's College in London. She's published 20 books. She appears regularly on BBC Radio, and she's acted as consultant to professional productions of ancient drama at the Royal Shakespeare Company, the National Theatre, among others. Dr. Hall lectures all over the world and is published widely in many academic and mainstream journals and newspapers. Her original specialty was ancient Greek literature, but she writes and speaks about all aspects of ancient Greek and Roman history, society, and thought. We're psyched to have her on the show. Hi, Dr. Hall. Welcome to the program.
Hello, Jordan. Pleased to be with you.
Thanks. So I just want to start by asking you, I like to ask all of my guests this question. How did you become a classics major? What gravitated you towards studying the ancient world?
Well, I think there are three answers to that, and they're all in there. One is that my dad was a Protestant, he's still alive, Protestant priest. So there were actually strange things like the New Testament in Greek lying around our house. So I asked him about the strange writing. It fascinated me. Then I was a absolutely avid TV watcher. When people say television is bad for children, well, I watched so much TV, but maybe it was better quality in those days. And I just used to watch movies like Jason and the Argonauts, the great early 1960s.
Ray Harryhausen, yeah.
Yeah, with the great Harryhausen special effect. And I just thought it was the coolest thing I had ever seen in my life.
It is the coolest thing.
Amazing. And then I really went, once I was given the opportunity to read some Greek literature in English, actually, not Greek, things like the Odyssey and the tragedies, I just found it the most wonderful sort of escape zone of my life. And I nearly read English at university, and I even got a place to do English and classics, combination. And once I'd gone to university, I thought, well, I can read English for the rest of my life, and I do. I read English literature. But was I ever going to sit down, and be at Oxford and be able to read all of Homer and all of Aristotle in Greek? No. So I'd actually changed to full classics in the end.
So did you have Latin and Greek training when you were growing up, or did you learn these languages?
Yeah, I was incredibly lucky. I'm one of the last generation a British state school kids, so not fee paying and public system, who got offered them. I mean, that's all gone now. It's practically all gone, and there's a terrible apartheid in Britain educationally, that 93% of our teenagers go to state school, only 7% go to fee paying school, and that 7% can get, most of them still get Latin and Greek, and it seems to me a great injustice.
Yeah, it's the same situation here in the States. I am lucky enough to work at a charter school that teaches Latin and Greek, and they make the kids take it. So I want to hold up your 2015 book. This is called Introducing the Ancient Greeks, From Bronze Age Seafarers to Navigators of the Western Mind. This book was fantastic. It's really beautifully written and highly accessible. And it makes some big, broad claims, and I actually like when authors do that. It's fun for someone who's new to this, so I like that. It has 10 chapters, and each of the 10 chapters visits a different Greek community at different moments over the course of the 20 centuries. You go through all of that. You start with the rise of the Mycenaean world, starting at around 1600 BC, and you end with the victory of Christianity over the pagan world there during the 4th century AD. For this show, I was particularly interested in your chapter on Athens. I think that's chapter 5, as it pertains to Greek drama and philosophy. But I wanted to start with the preface and the introduction of your book, and I'd like to read a short segment of your book and then get a response from you. In this passage, you're talking about the advances, the innovations, the contributions delivered by the Greeks, and I want to read this. Please bear with me. It's a little bit of a long one, but I really want to get your response on this. It has become a new orthodoxy that the Greeks were very similar to their ancient Near Eastern neighbors in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Levant, Persia, and Asia Minor. Some scholars have gone so far as to ask whether the Greeks came up with anything new at all, or whether they merely acted as a conduit through which the combined wisdom of all the civilizations of Eastern Mediterranean was disseminated across the territories conquered by Alexander the Great before arriving at Rome and posterity. Others have seen sinister racist motives at work and accused classicists of creating in their own image the oldest dead white European males. Some have even claimed that classicists have systematically distorted and concealed the evidence showing how much the ancient Greeks owed to Semitic and African peoples rather than to Indo-European traditions. And I'm just going to do this one last paragraph here. The question has thus become painfully politicized. Critics of colonialism and racism tend to play down the specialness of the ancient Greeks. Those who still maintain that there was something identifiably different and even superior about the Greeks, on the other hand, are usually conservatives who have a vested interest in proving the superiority of Western ideals and in making evaluative judgments of culture. My problem, and that's you, is that I fit into neither camp. I'm certainly opposed to colonialism and racism, and have investigated reactionary abuses of the classical tradition. But my constant engagement with the ancient Greeks and their culture has made me more, rather than less, convinced that they evinced a cluster of brilliant qualities that are difficult to identify in combination, and in such concentration elsewhere in Mediterranean or in ancient Near Eastern antiquity. So a cluster of brilliant qualities that is difficult to find elsewhere in Mediterranean or ancient Near Eastern history. So Dr. Hall, what are these qualities? What makes the Greeks special as a people? In your introduction, you list 10 distinct qualities. Can you talk about these qualities, if you can remember all 10 or at least some of them, and maybe bring this into a broader discussion about what these general qualities led to over time, and maybe even for us? How did these qualities enable certain artistic, philosophical, cultural achievements?
Okay, it's a matter of these qualities. I think there is a character, a cultural personality of the ancient Greek, partly defined by the very language that they spoke, and so how their brains were formed by that language. And I do think we can describe it. But before I do that, I also think we can try and explain how some of their qualities, which are actually now getting them into a lot of trouble, and meaning that finding it doesn't work quite so well in global capitalism, some of those qualities were precisely what enabled them to, for example, invent rational science, empirical medicine, and philosophy, and those other great achievements. So it's a matter of those qualities in a particular time and place, not that those qualities are sort of transcendentally superior. The other thing I would really like to emphasise, because the paragraphs you've read out, parts of them have been quoted selectively, very controversially by people who are trying to make out that I'm precisely an old-fashioned colonial racist.
Oh, that's a shame.
I know, it's okay, but people do this in this highly sensitive arena. You are walking on eggshells, and I knew if I came out and said, actually, to underestimate what the invention of rational science, empirical medicine, and philosophy, and the laws of logic, by Aristotle, the actual setting out, the enthymeme, and all the rest of it, to underestimate that achievement is itself extremely dangerous, and shows that we're living in terror of kangaroo courts and political correctness and not being allowed free discussion. So I knew I was going to get criticised, but my big answer to that, and the bit that those people who make that argument always leave out, is that I say that one of their great gifts was this openness we'll talk about with Athens, which is that they were by far the most multicultural of the ancient Mediterranean societies. They were in contact with far more groups. They intermarried everywhere they went. They had extraordinary cultural absorption and hybridity. So they're like somewhere like New York at its very, very best, with as many different languages going on, down the side streets from the major avenues, leading to this wonderful flowering of intercultural cross-fertilization. So they got to give us all the ideas of the Egyptians, the Sumerians, the Thracians, the Scythians, the Hittites, the North Africans, the Nubians, precisely because they were the ones in these incredibly fast little boats skidding around founding colonies and intermarrying everywhere. So my argument is actually that to say that they're really great is to say that multiculturalism is great. So I just need to say that.
And you were very careful about that. You were actually actively going out and making the case that it was not some innate genetic superiority predisposition, that this is this interesting flowering, this cultural moment in history, and I don't want to say accidental, but it's...
They lived. The crucial thing is, you just look at a map of how they lived. They lived all around, not just the Mediterranean, but the Black Sea as well. And this is crucial. The northeastern Greeks were some of the most brilliant at philosophy, especially post-classical philosophy. And the colonies up there, which started in the 8th, 9th centuries BC, it was the experience of actually having to build ships that could survive Black Sea conditions and things like that brought on navigation and astronomy and so many other basic skills. And viticulture. You know why viticulture developed? You know how they discovered plant grafting, how to actually do genetic modification of plants, because they could not make wine in the North Black Sea, and the Greeks had to have their wine. So they spent 200 years figuring out how to create a vine. So it's that necessity being the mother of invention kind of thing. But they never lived, or hated to live, more than 25 miles inland. So the map of ancient Greece is not the map of ancient Greece, it's a map of the ancient Greek-speaking city-states fringing both the Mediterranean and the Black Sea for 25 miles in contact with hundreds of other ethnic groups. They didn't have this idea of a big inland landmass. The only set of Greeks who ever went very, very far inland were those who went with Alexander across the Punjab and Afghanistan to India. And you know what? They lost their language in 200 years. The ones who went inland did. The ones who stayed on the coasts still are speaking Greek.
That's interesting. That's so interesting.
Absolutely, because their real relationship is with the Greeks just over the water, right? So what I tried to do in that book, which got very very harshly criticised by some orthodox classicists, including in the Wall Street Journal. The reviewer there said, "This is extraordinary. She's giving us a history of the ancient Greeks from the point of view of the sea. Where's the polis in all this?" Now, I do mention city-state absolutely all the time. Every chapter's about a different city-state. But I did exactly say, let's look at them as seafarers, because I think that is a fundamental part of their identity and their cultural personality. That openness that the Athenians, I mean, all of them were like that. But I think the ones who were the most like that, in the most concentrated form, because they were conscious of it and proud of it, and actually advocated it as a conscious policy, and said, we are the great innovators because we welcome everybody. They actually said it.
Right, I remember that from chapter 5.
Best of North American, outward-looking, welcoming. We are the greatest country in the world because we are every country in the world. Right. That was very much the ancient Athenian attitude. And when they needed expertise from either other Greek city-states, so Pericles, in the glory days of Athens that I write about in that chapter, who is general, which means basically president, at the time that Sophocles was writing, for example, his great tragedies, he set about inviting the greatest minds from all over the world to come to Athens. He brought Herodotus over from Turkey. What's now Turkey. Herodotus, who invented history, was half not Greek, probably. He was from Caria and Lycia. He invited the great northern Greek philosophers, Democritus, who invented the atom, and Protagoras, who invented democratic political theory. He invited them down from northern Greece. He invited Gorgias from Sicily. He invited great shipwrights from Crete, the great sea captains from the islands. So he knew exactly what he was doing.
Yeah, and there was a great quote in there. I mean, your chapter is actually called "The Open Society of Athens," and I'll read my listeners another quote here. You say that democratic Athens brought Greek civilization to the, quote, apex of creativity, and you go on to say that of all the Greek communities studied in this book, the classical Athenians, perhaps to a greater degree than any other community you studied, quote, demonstrated their ample endowment with every one of the 10 characteristics that define the ancient Greek mindset. And you go on, quote, yet the feature of the Athenian character that underlies every aspect of their collective achievement is undoubtedly their openness to innovation, to adopting ideas from outside, and to self-expression. Can you elaborate on how their openness and how their welcoming philosophy, can you elaborate on what that led to, what qualities that produced in them for this great civilization? I
mean, it might be helpful if we try and run through the other 9 characteristics.
Right, right.
So the first one I kick off when I talk about the actual Mycenaean world is that they're seafarers. So that in so many ways, they were cultural amphibians, they were brilliant swimmers and divers, but they felt very restless if they couldn't get on their ships and scuttle around, finding out, like Odysseus, about the other creatures inhabiting the universe. They were extremely stroppy. Do you use the word stroppy in America?
We do not. Okay. That's a Britishism.
It means rebellious if you feel that you're being oppressed in any way.
So rebellious against authority.
Yeah, rebellious against authority, questioning of authority. So they still are. And they find working in hierarchies extraordinarily difficult. I think there is actually a fundamentally egalitarian streak. They're not at all good at serving other people if they think they're stupid or whatever. So this is why they constantly colonized everywhere, because they fell out with each other, or some fell out with their fathers. Or very often you had a poor family where the oldest brother got the farm. The younger brothers had a choice of either basically slaving away for the older brother or going off and finding their own new. This is very pioneer sort of spirit, and I think a lot of Americans really relate to that. So they're fundamentally highly independent. They are highly individualistic. So this is the first great literature in the world where the author's always telling you his name or her name. So Sappho says, I'm Sappho and I'm singing of Aphrodite. Or Herodotus says, these are the inquiries of Herodotus of Halicarnassus. Or even on the beautiful vases we've got from classical Athens, the one that people imagine when you think of a Greek vase, the red and black ones, they say things like, I was made by Exarchestides. Exarchestides writes his name on it. So they have this strong sense of the I. They're obsessively curious, inquisitive, but in a good way. I mean, it can get them into trouble. It nearly gets Odysseus' all his men killed by the Cyclops,
right,
because he wants to know what's going on in the cave. But it can equally lead you to say, I don't believe that river is clogging up. This is how ancient science began. This is how it began. I do not believe that the river Meander is getting silted up because God is angry. I believe it's getting silted up because the waters are bringing down lots of silt, there's alluvial dust, and depositing it.
Right, exactly.
So the curiosity led them to go beyond religious explanations, go beyond superstition. And we're all indebted to that. We are incredibly indebted to that curiosity. Then you've got the openness of Athens. You've got the humour of Sparta, which people found it very funny that I put humour in this grim militaristic society, but I did.
That is surprising.
Yes, I know, but I actually think they brought a certain kind of wit, the mordant wit that gets you through tough things. I actually decided that I was going to talk about that in Sparta. Why not? Because we've got these whole collections of humorous Spartan sayings.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Okay. If you've watched the movie 300, you get a few of them from Gerard Butler.
That's right.
So somebody comes to him when he's only got a few hundred men and he's got the entire Persian army coming and saying, they say, the sky is black because of their archers. You have no idea. The sky is black. It is so full of arrows. So he says, no, let's flee from the battlefield, but let's fight in the shade.
I know, that's such a great line.
Exactly. Or the Persian king traditionally demanded some earth from, when he invaded Greece, he thought everybody would capitulate because he so outnumbered them and his forces had such superior just weaponry, military hardware. So he sent to Sparta and said, you have to give me some soil to show that you capitulate. This was the initial thing if you wanted to avoid battle. And, Leonidas, king of the Spartans, just says, Molon Labic, come and get it. Tell him to come and get it. So it's this very, very, very brief, concise humour. Right. Then when you get to the next century, 3rd century BC, you get the enormous Greeks. The Greeks in their sense of only big is great, right? So you've got the Library of Alexandria. We don't just have a few papyrus rolls. We have to create the biggest library that anybody's ever created in the world. And we have to have the biggest this and the biggest that. And not only that, we're going to translate every piece of literature in every language in the world into Greek. That's when the Septuagint, the Hebrew text, started getting translated into Greek. I mean, it's just, this is after Alexander, of course, but we've had the biggest empire. Now we need the biggest library, and they start building bigger and better ships. Then the last 3 chapters are about the brilliance of their language and just their superb prose books, which come very much under the Roman Empire. And I think I've missed out one, I just can't remember what it is, but the very final chapter is about pleasure. And one of I think, the most important things that distinguished pagan Olympian religion from the Christianity that did conquer it was this very strong pleasure principle, that actually bodily pleasure, cultural pleasure, aesthetic pleasure, physical pleasure, eating, drinking and sex are all actually really wonderful. And when you're doing them, you're doing it for the glory of God. I mean, literally, you have magnificent festivals, you get incredibly drunk, you go to the Temple of Aphrodite to get as sexy as you possibly can when you're getting married or whatever. This, of course, was complete anathema to the early Christians. So right. You hear who even shut down the theatres. It wasn't just the temples. They couldn't have dancing, they couldn't have their beautiful music, they couldn't have their laughter. And I think that's one way that the ancient Greeks are actually really, post-Freud, come back into their own. People don't want to be told they're sinners if they enjoy themselves. Of course, right. We need morality, and of course we need moderation in some of our pleasures.
Absolutely.
But the idea that pleasure is inherently evil is something I think very few people, except for those in monotheistic religions, now hold.
I imagine this is kind of where Nietzsche gets a lot of his thinking from. the idea that to suppress what is pleasurable is in some sense anti-human or something like that. And the idea
Professor of Greek at Basel. I mean, he is Professor of Greek literature. He has the same job as me. I mean,
yeah, totally. So that was great. So one thing I want to ask from the introduction is, I also liked what you said about the tendency in modern scholarship of downplaying the role of individual excellence in the shaping of history. Because I think for the last 30 or 40 years, it's been trendy to just emphasize the extent to which social, economic, political forces mold the individual, shape history, and obviously they do. But this is, I think, often done to the exclusion of looking at the individual, maybe even the heroic figures that change and shape the course of history. You say, quote, "This type of account assumes that history is uncomplicated enough to be understood without acknowledging the individual brains," I like how you put that, "as well as broad contexts," unquote. So can you elaborate on this point for my listeners just a little bit? Because I was so struck by that and kind of surprised that you had the gall to say that, and I was impressed.
Well, I don't see it as gall. I mean, I'm going to warn you, I'm going to use a word called Marxism here, okay? So I am, broadly speaking, when I try to understand the history of the world, a Marxist.
Oh, you're talking to a libertarian right here.
Okay. I'm a Marxist. I'm a moral. I mean, Marxism not as a political position, but as a way of understanding history.
Okay.
That is simply that economic forces and economic circumstances, the availability of raw materials, and economic exigency, the need to get fed, watered, survive, these are broadly speaking the most important determinants of human history. Okay, I do genuinely believe that, and that competition over those natural resources and who commands them is a motor of history, and that the hatred between different economic classes that produces, especially since the Industrial Revolution, has always been a motor of change and of history, of revolution.
I agree with you.
That makes me a Marxist with a small m. Okay, it does. And I always, whenever I look at any new society, say, where is the money coming from? What is the industry? You know, what is the source of income? Who owns the factories or farmland or whatever? That is how I go about it. And actually, I think most of us do. I think most sensible historians these days are Marxists with a small m. Okay, that does not make us revolutionary communists. That's just different. Okay, but in France, they have a tradition of that, which is called anti-humanist, right? Which means that everything is reduced to economic
right,
forces.
which is what I can't stand. I don't like that.
I am a good old-fashioned British humanist who, while accepting completely that we've got to do huge amounts of economic history to understand change, that human beings are agents, and human beings differ, and human beings have different gifts, and that the right gift at the right time can be absolutely transformative in either hastening or impeding these rather grim forces that we can't necessarily do an awful lot about. You know, if we run out of coal, we run out of coal, but we might have a brilliant mind like Aristotle, a scientist, who said, well, what if we use the sun to power things, right? If you haven't got the brilliant guy who'd been trained at Plato's academy, right, the right mind, the right time, the right nurturing, and I think that's what, because once the Greeks realised the nature of the human intellect, that's the other thing. You don't find the Sumerians or the ancient Egyptians talking about somebody being incredibly able intellectually. You don't find it. You have great warriors and great kings. The Greeks got that nous, intelligence, mind, is something that you can have more or less of, and that it can be radically changed by education. So that you can either completely, Aristotle's very, very good on this, you can completely wreck someone's potential by abusing them as a child or not educating them properly, and you can completely facilitate their potential. And his potential was facilitated. He rolled up at the academy when he was 17, and he founded almost all are ways of doing empirical science as well as moral philosophy. I mean, he's a giant.
Oh, yeah. He did everything, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we remember him for his logic and his ethics, but he did everything, right?
Well, he's the father of zoology. People just don't realise this. And he invented, most importantly, though it sort of sounds dry, but the rules of logic which apply to all the disciplines.
Right.
He was the one who formulated them.
Absolutely.
And it's in the Organon, it's in these 6, unbelievably, he worked out every single syllogism you could possibly use, and it sounds so dry as dust, but people who are drawing inferences from observations every day are Aristotelian.
Right.
Full stop. I mean, you know that, you studied philosophy.
Yes. Yeah. So
but here you see, he comes along in the 4th century after, Socrates. He goes to the academy, which Plato and Socrates founded. But it's only he's already building on hundreds, decades of Greek science and philosophy, and he's brilliant.
Like who specifically, who is he drawing on the most, would you say?
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, and that is now, my next book is about Aristotle.
I read about that.
Yeah. He takes half of it from Plato. I mean, he's clearly a Platonist in response, but this unbelievable, overwhelming difference that the only world that matters is the world we're in now, the material world that we can see around us and experience as physical bodies, and that we will die. When we die.
Right.
Coming to be and passing away. But that as the most superior animal, he's the only, Plato doesn't go around calling humans an animal. We know we're simply the political animal. We're just slightly more advanced animal than any other. We have total responsibility because we can deliberate to the planet. I mean, this has huge ramifications for environmentalism, apart from anything else, that we are responsible for this planet as the best animal, or not the morally best at all. In fact, he says humans can do a lot more harm than animals because of this intellectual ability. So in that, he's a Democritean. In that, he takes the atomism.
Right.
Of the material scientists. He's also a Democrat, I think, ultimately. Although he, and Plato certainly isn't. Ultimately, although he criticises all 4 types of constitution, democracy, monarchy, oligarchy, and tyranny, he absolutely condemns the 3 non-democratic ones more. Interesting enough, for today, he says the great fault of democracy is it can easily slip into tyranny if you don't educate the people.
Right, and instead Plato said, well, you still got to educate the people, but democracy's bad. Democracy's not...
We simply can't ever educate them enough to make laws.
Right.
I mean, it is fundamentally elitist.
I don't know if you read Arthur Herman's The Cave and the Light. Did you get a chance to look at that?
I don't know.
It's about Plato and Aristotle, and I think his project, I haven't read the whole thing, but I think his project is to sort of document how Aristotle's philosophy has been sort of embraced by the conservative right, interestingly enough. And Plato more so in the domain of continental philosophy and postmodernism and that sort of thing. So that interesting split.
Aristotle, though, has been claimed by the left too. I mean, Karl Marx thought he was a genius.
Because he was a dialectical materialist.
Well, I'm not sure he was a dialectical materialist, but he was certainly a materialist. And to me, the great split in European philosophy is between materialism and idealism.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that split is between Plato and Aristotle.
And that's what his book is about, exactly.
Yeah, right. But I don't think the materialism, that tends to get because of the way that word is understood in a popular way.
I know.
It's quite difficult to explain that it actually simply means that we don't think there's another transcendental word of ideas or an afterlife or active gods or whatever, that what we're interested in all the time is the here and now and improving it. I mean, the way I understand that in Christian terms is I was brought up in a Christian household. I can kind of do that, which is split between the sort of 17th century Protestants who are quite clear that we're building the kingdom of heaven here, not waiting for it in the other life.
Right.
Do you see what I mean?
Yes, I do.
I think humans have got the brains to sort most of our problems if we have the will, and create as near to heaven as the fact that we're mortals. I think we have that potential, and I think Aristotle thought we had that potential.
Yeah.
But
so that's a progressive idea.
We're not activating our potential, and none of us takes enough responsibility for other people doing so. And he's very clear that we all live in a society. Anyway, you can hear that I'm a bit obsessed with Aristotle at the moment.
I love his virtue ethics. I read Michael Sandel's book, Justice, and he spends, I don't know, a fourth of the book talking about virtue ethics. And I teach ethics, and I spend a long time on it as well. It's just so different from consequentialism and utilitarianism and Kantian ethics. It's just so radically different. But I want to actually shift on to I want to go back a little bit to the openness. You talk about the cultural openness of ancient Athens. You were referring to this before. You quoted Pericles in a speech where he's praising the Athenian soldiers who had died in battle, and he says, quote, "We throw open our city to the world and never expel a foreigner or prevent him from seeing or learning anything." And you go on to say that Athenians were fearless about allowing others to scrutinize their way of life from within, which I love that, fearless to criticism. Yeah. I was fascinated by this passage, and to be honest, the first thing that came to my mind was this concept that goes back to Homer of xenia, and which, I mean, this is like rough translation, but it means like guest-host relationship. Both sides have an obligation, hospitality, that sort of thing. So I'm wondering if this openness stems from something that's deeply embedded within Greek mythology. I'm wondering if this openness stems from the idea of xenia and the fact that this idea of being hospitable looms so large in the Greek psyche. Yeah, well, it still does. I mean, I have to say, there is nobody better at inviting the whole street to a party in the world than the Greeks. There just isn't. But having said that, no, you're quite right. The trouble with xenia is precisely trying to find a translation that's adequate to it. When people talk about hospitality or guests and friends, it sounds like the hotel business or something. Right, right. Tourist business. This is about one of the biggest terrors in ancient society. That is, going in, it's the right, xenia means the right of, accepted by international sense of decency, right, for an unarmed man to go into a foreign country and pass amongst people in safety. If they touch him, the Greeks thought they would be hit with a thunderbolt. They actually, such is the religious protection, such is the taboo. This enabled heralds, ambassadors, and diplomats and businessmen, when it's working, to move freely without fear in a place where they could easily be murdered and robbed, just like that, without anybody, any comeback, they have no legal rights, right? This is about a fundamental taboo that goes beyond law. Equally, if you're a host in Greece, if you invite, if 6 or 7 people from another country turn up and you say, come into my house for dinner, I mean, what is to stop them getting up in the middle of the night, stabbing you or raping your women, right? And just Zeus. Only that taboo. And that is the incredibly powerful thing. Now, the point about the Athenians, you're absolutely right, but it's that they created a culture where that was the accepted norm completely. So even though the Athenians weren't even that religious, I think it was quite secularized. They were incredibly proud of the fact, and as Aristotle says, they certainly never bore arms, which is another thing current Americans could do well to think about. They thought that was shocking. Right. Completely shocking if you had a society where citizens had to bear arms, right? Because the whole idea is that xenia, the absolute imperative that you can meet strangers all the time while feeling safe, which we still have a little bit of in this country. I don't feel frightened when I go into a classroom or on the underground. I do not, the chances of me getting shot are so tiny relative. And I think in America, it has a little bit more to do with actually our history with your nation. Bizarrely. Leaving leaving and seceding and forming a new nation and having militias that needed to take up arms.
I know.
It's going to be, speaking of that, it's going to be really difficult to make any kind of change in that direction.
I do understand all of that history. I also understand how something that starts out as a positive freedom thing can dialectically change into its opposite. But what Aristotle says is that no lawgiver can ever anticipate all future developments. The laws must be constantly susceptible to revision in the light of evidence. I mean, he's quite absolutely. So this idea that founding fathers of any kind have their words written in stone, it would be anathema. You just don't do that. I just find it interesting. All I'm trying to say is it's interesting that one of the definitions of Athenian open society was only a really crazy place would have lots of weapons in it.
Gotcha.
Weapons of the battlefield against your enemies.
Yeah, right.
They're just not for when you're talking to each other and walking down the street in a civilized urban environment.
Right. To be fair to the founding fathers, I will say this. I think that one of the things they did get right was this idea that the country and the Constitution is founded on these negative rights. So just rights from being messed with. And then you're right. The laws from within that, we can vote to change anything. Yeah. But those negative rights, that's the platform that doesn't change. To be fair to people who don't understand what originalism means to Americans. Okay. But I also, towards the end of the chapter, you talk about city Dionysia, and I wanted to get into that because you wrote quite a bit about this towards the end of that chapter. This is the Athenian festival where the tragedies were actually performed, and I'm doing a series of 3 episodes about Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. And so I wanted to ask you because I actually found it quite hard to get any specific information about the way that these festivals worked. What were they like? In your book, you write about Dionysiac processions and singing and dancing and hymns and sacrifices. So could you walk my listeners through this festival? How did it work?
Oh, okay. Well, first of all, I think those of your listeners who've ever been lucky enough to go to India or to Malaysian countries which have polytheistic festivals, or even Japan, right, need to think in terms of the kind of colour and noise and smells and bells of the temples. You get a much I found that the bustle, the sense of bustle and food roasting and perfumes and noise and constant clanging and prayers and undressing and dressing of beautiful painted colourful statues. That is what you have to think in terms of, not like quite white sages going around in stable roles. So the entire city comes to a standstill. So this is April, the Great Dionysia. It's a very exciting time of year in Greece. The weather starts to get really lovely, but it's not overly hot. The blossom is out. The birds are singing. The grasshoppers are growing off on the trees again. And the ships are coming into the harbour. That is the crucial thing that they didn't sail much in the deep winter. Actually, it was Philip of Macedon who started that. Before that, they didn't. So everything, spring is springing like nothing on earth. And the city is absolutely packed because everybody from all over the Greek world came to this. So it's a combination of Super Bowl, Christmas, Easter, Super Bowl, Olympics, World Cup, and religion is in there as well.
How were the tragedies that were going to be performed? How were they selected? What? How did that all work?
Okay. It was all very democratic. So about a year before the festival, anybody who wanted could submit a play to the chief magistrate for that year, who was elected by a combination of lot and vote. It's quite a complicated, highly democratic system. And he'd pick 3. But he had to be careful because in classical Athens, when magistrates, even if they got some executive power like that, really got given a hard time if
right.
if he'd gone completely against what people like. So there was a famous year when Euripides didn't get picked, and everybody got really angry about that. Okay. And then when he picked the three, he allocated them their actors, and this is really, really important. So the poet would have a vague sense. He wouldn't have written the whole play. He'd have sent in a précis, an idea, and he would have he got actors allocated to them. There were a team of professional actors paid for by the state. So depending on who was your actor, so I'm pretty sure that the years when you have a play with a huge role for a woman, like Medea or Antigone, this is because you've got an actor who was particularly good, because they're all men,
right,
particularly good at either middle-aged women or teenage girls.
What a talent!
Because it was an entirely masked performance, what you actually looked like didn't matter at all.
Right.
So you could theoretically have quite elderly men playing a brilliant Antigone. Why not? Right.
Right.
So you got your actors and you got your chorus about halfway through the year. So the whole company got about 6 months to train.
Wow.
All paid for. You were also allocated a prominent rich guy.
Oh, I heard about that.
Yeah, volunteered. So if you were a steak factory owner and a multi-millionaire, to curry favour with the public, you volunteered and to pay for the chorus, because that meant keeping 12 young men, feeding them, housing them, training them, and providing their costumes. And how well or not they performed, the chorus line was very important. People who like the American musical tradition get this in a way that actually European theatre people don't. You know the importance of the good chorus line to make a show.
Yeah.
It's exciting in American theatre. So he funded that. And then you competed against the other two guys who'd been picked as playwrights. Some of the tragic writers seem to have got more involved in the actual production side than others. Sophocles had been an actor, and I think was very involved. I can't prove this, but my hunch is that he was very involved, at least in actor training.
So
direction.
he was the guy. He was the one who introduced the third actor onto the stage.
He's very, very interested in what a small group of very talented actors can do, and introducing a third actor, of course, absolutely transforms your ability to do tragic irony, because you can have two people discussing something, but you're actually watching the effect on the third person,
right,
who may be silent. Mm-hmm. And the most famous instance of that of all is in Oedipus, when Oedipus is learning from the shepherd that actually he was adopted. What we're all watching, Jocasta, his wife, right? So that's the sort of brilliant effect that Sophocles learned how to use. And he was also very famous for his, compared with the other two, for his very plain words. His characters spoke in really very clear and lucid, non-poetic Greek. I mean, it was verse, but he was famous for that, because it's actually very hard philosophically and politically, Sophocles. So he didn't distract you with flowery language. He puts these simple political issues like Antigone standing up against Creon, saying, what you passed is not the sort of law I follow, right? I follow the laws of the gods, right? But it's very, very clear and concise, because that's quite a complicated, big idea.
I think you're right about that. Yeah. So I wanted to ask you one last question. Yeah. And again, thank you so much for spending your time with me.
My pleasure.
What did all of this have to do with Dionysus? I haven't been able to get a clear answer on this. I actually went in search of articles, and everyone said something different.
What's it got to do with Dionysus? Well, that's one of those questions that keeps people like me in a job, because we give whole courses called What's It Got to Do with Dionysus? The fundamental answer to that is actually simply institutional and contextual. These plays were put on at the festivals of Dionysus, right? So they're fundamentally associated in the Greek mind, just as putting on lots of costumes of witches is associated with All Halloween. Now, why on earth would all the saints want you to dress up as something from Star Trek, but people do, right?
Yeah.
So in a sense, it's not the right question. Anthropologically and ritually, people have pointed to all kinds of things within the worship of Dionysus, though, that you can begin to sense an affinity. One is that in the rites for Dionysus, there was cross-dressing. We know that men dressed up as Maenads, who were Bacchantes, right, when they were worshipping Dionysus. We know that cross-dressing happened. The altered states of consciousness that wine can bring about, and the release of emotion safely, because you're doing it collectively, together, and drinking the same amount while watching these stories. I think that applies a bit more to comedy, in a way, because they went back in the afternoons are really quite drunk.
Right.
Active, collective use of alcohol to let off steam, right? And that both helps you think about suffering and have a good cry in the mornings when you're watching the tragedies. The other side of it that is masks. We know that masks were used in the worship of Dionysus. Also, the musical instrument associated with Dionysus is not the harp, that's Apollo, right? But these very loud pipes, which are like two tiny oboes. So they've got reeds, and you play them at the same time, which means one's playing a sort of continuous note, and the other one, that instrument is what all the choruses sang to. So it's easier to put together. Also, tragedy just means, you know what it means? It means goat song. One of the things that you do for Dionysus is sacrifice a goat. Yeah? So it looks as though sometime hundreds of years before Sophocles, some sort of proto-theatre had happened when you sacrificed the goat to Dionysus. With masks, maybe cross-dressing.
Oh.
But actually, it's invented at a very particular moment in the 6th century BC by the new sole leader of Athens, Pisistratus, who wants to curry favour with the people. And he actually literally invents tragedy in terms of the big state competitions. He says, we're going to have great shows from now on, and I will pay for them. and we will do them at the festivals of Dionysus, mainly because the other big god was already taken up, Athena.
And he was trying to unite Greece in a way? He was trying to unite Greece in a way?
He was trying to put Athens on the map as a place that Athens is not important in archaic literature. There aren't any Athenian heroes to speak of in the Iliad.
True.
Right?
Yeah.
Athens is a new city compared with Argos and Mycenae and Sparta, even Ithaca. So he's saying, hey, we're going to have the biggest and the best performances you've ever seen, and seems to quite literally have said, I'm founding a tragedy competition. I will put money in, and it should be at the Festival of Dionysus.
Pretty cool.
Yeah, so another great individual to give a ring to our interview, that he had the kind of talent to see that would be a really great thing every spring, to get people coming to Athens, bringing money into the economy, and having a jolly good time, and he did.
Well, very good. I want to thank you so much for spending time with me. And for my listeners, please, again, pick up Introducing the Ancient Greeks. This book is fantastic and so readable.
Aristotle's Way is coming out in America with Penguin next January.
Next January. Okay. And just briefly, Aristotle's Way is about...
It's actually a self-help book, how Aristotle's ethics can change your life. This is Dale Carnegie Gets Aristotle.
Cool. I'm really excited about that. Thank you again.
Thank you too. Will you let me know because I will tweet out the link when you get it up.
Absolutely.
Okay.
All right, thanks a lot.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.
So for the second half of this episode, I want to talk about the great tragedian Aeschylus. We're going to focus on his most important work, the Oresteia. You might call Aeschylus the father of Greek tragedy. JFK, at the death of Martin Luther King Jr., is famous for quoting Aeschylus. He said, "Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." Aeschylus, who lived from 525 to 456 BC, is the oldest of the three great tragedians. He's also the earliest tragedian whose works currently survive. He was born at Eleusis, a town near Athens and the home of an important religious cult, the Eleusinian Mysteries. Now, we know very little about Aeschylus' life, though there are a few things we do know. Aeschylus fought in the Persian Wars, likely at Marathon and Salamis. On his gravestone, he had inscribed that he had fought at the Trojan Wars, though he said nothing about the fact that he wrote tragedies, so that gives you a sense of what he valued. He won his first victory at the city Dionysia, the competition of tragic drama that I mentioned, in 484 BC. Now, Aeschylus favored writing trilogies on unified themes, which explored the development of one story throughout the three plays in a trilogy. The Oresteia, which we'll look at in this episode, is our only surviving example of one of these trilogies. It's the only complete trilogy that has survived. And for this reason, Aeschylus is unbelievably valuable to theater historians and classicists. Again, only 7 of Aeschylus' plays have survived, though he probably wrote 70 to 90 plays in total. The first of these 7 surviving tragedies was called The Persians, which is actually the earliest extant tragedy that comes down to us. This dramatizes the defeat of the Persians at the Battle of Salamis, or you might say the Persian reaction to this defeat. This play was followed by the plays Seven Against Thebes and Suppliant Maidens. And then you have what is rightfully considered Aeschylus' most important work, as I mentioned, the Oresteia. The 7th Aeschylus play that has survived, Prometheus Bound, might not have actually been written by Aeschylus. Many scholars believe that this play was actually written by his grandson, who is also named Aeschylus, which is why some scholars believe it wasn't written by the original Aeschylus. We're not sure. We happen to know that Aeschylus' sons and grandsons also wrote tragedies, so this is where the confusion lies. At this point, we want to ask, why did these 7 tragedies survive and not all of his other plays? Is it random? Well, not really. We owe the preservation of the texts that have come down to us to the Byzantine Empire. Around the 3rd century AD, a selection of 7 Aeschylus plays, the 7 that came down to us, was made for use by schools in the Byzantine Empire. Now, this selection of 7 was later reduced to 3 plays. These 3 are often referred to as the Byzantine Triad, and they are The Persians, Prometheus Bound, and Seven Against Thebes, which were used as textbooks by Byzantine schoolboys, mostly to learn grammar. Now, the other 4 books that survived were culturally and thematically important enough to be passed down, but many people wonder why these other texts survived while many others didn't. The Byzantine scholars who chose these plays didn't always admire classical texts for the same reason, say, that modern scholars would. Their interests in literature were different than ours, understandably. The Byzantine government valued administrators who had a good prose writing style and a good understanding of Greek syntax, language, and vocabulary. So as far as we can tell, the selections of ancient Greek texts which were used in schools at this time and in this society seem to have been chosen and used primarily for their rhetorical, grammatical, linguistic features. Thus, the survival of Persians, Prometheus Bound, Seven Against Thebes, and Suppliant Maidens probably depended on stylistic points and the language that was used in those plays, rather than any inherent dramatic or thematic features of the plays, which is what we tend to appreciate drama for now. The plays were not valued as dramas in the Byzantine Empire. They were valued as storehouses of grammatical knowledge for students to pattern their own writing style on. So that gives you some of the background that you need to understand the history of this and how these stories get passed down. Now let's jump into the Oresteia. To understand what's going on when you read the Oresteia, you need to have a bit of a sense of the mythic background. The Oresteia assumes that its audience is familiar with a couple of myths. First, the Trojan War. In the 5th century BC, the Trojan War was seen as the major episode that marked the end of what was called the heroic age and the start of what became known as the purely human age, or what you would call human history. The heroic age is thought of as the age of myth. The stories of this time tell of a great race of men who were, you might say, closer to the gods. Stories like the Trojan War, encapsulated in the Iliad and the Odyssey. The men of this age were heroic and were possessed of qualities that average men do not possess. The Greeks of the classical age, it's important to note, believed that they were ancestors of these ancient heroes. It was very important to the people of 5th century Athens to be able to trace their lineage and cultural identity back to the heroes and events of the Trojan War. This mythical consciousness is one reason why the tragedies of 5th century Athens, you might say, look back and attempt to reanimate the Trojan War and the mythical age. It's important to realize that the people of this age truly believed that the Trojan War happened in the way that Homer said it did. The people saw these myths as history. These events had really happened. This is why many of the tragedies deal with the events, themes, and mythical lore of the Trojan War. And again, if you want some of the background of the Trojan War, and if you want to get a better sense of the story of the Iliad and the Odyssey, you can look back to episodes 2, 3, and 4 of this podcast. All of these events, the events leading up to the Trojan War and the events after the Trojan War, are closely connected to Agamemnon and Menelaus' family. Agamemnon and Menelaus are members of a family referred to as the House of Atreus. Their father was named Atreus. Their most obvious connection with the Trojan War was that Helen was the wife of Menelaus, and Agamemnon's wife, Clytemnestra, was actually the half-sister of Helen, and therefore Agamemnon and Menelaus obviously married half-sisters. The abduction of Helen in the Trojan War, which we talked about in episode 2, was obviously a great offense to the honor of Menelaus' entire family. Since Agamemnon was the older brother, though, it was actually Agamemnon's job to lead the great expedition to get Helen back, rather than Menelaus, which is something that's important to keep in mind. The abduction of Helen was also, as we discussed last episode, was also a violation of Xenia. So who is this guy, Agamemnon? Agamemnon is proud. He's kind of a jerk. He is someone who doesn't know his limits. And if you look back at the Iliad, this is something that deeply characterizes Agamemnon. Again, the Oresteia is concerned with the whole history of the House of Atreus. So that would be the extended family of Agamemnon and Menelaus. To understand the Oresteia, you have to know about the central element of this trilogy, the curse. The family of Atreus suffers from a hereditary curse that repeats itself generation after generation. I should back up and explain this here. The concept of a hereditary curse might be a bit strange to people in our society. The idea in ancient Greece of a hereditary curse, in short, is that moral guilt is kind of inheritable. Sort of like how monetary debts in our society are inheritable. So if a man does something that is dishonorable or terrible, that will affect his offspring. The retribution will be carried out against his offspring, so that his offspring will have to pay for what he did. So this is what is going on in the House of Atreus. This is the nature of the curse. The curse of the House of Atreus is a consequence of inappropriate and, you might say, excessive intergenerational violence. The parents in this family kill their children, we learn, for example, and children kill their parents. So in many ways, this story is the story of a family, a cursed family that is imploding from within. So let's do a brief summary of the trilogy. So to begin, the curse began not with Agamemnon, but with Agamemnon's great-grandfather Tantalus, the founder of the family, in a sense. You see, Tantalus offended the gods. There are two stories that tell how he offended the gods. The first story is that he tried to trick the gods into eating the flesh of his son Pelops. Tantalus killed his son, chopped him up, cooked him, and offered his flesh to the gods at a banquet. Now, why would he do something like this? Well, apparently, Tantalus was trying to indicate that the gods were not so superior to human beings, that they were not better than human beings. He was, in a sense, trying to fool the gods by tricking them into eating his son, which is a terrible act, which would make them, the gods, look immoral. Well, the gods were not tricked. They knew who Pelops was, and they actually resurrected him. And this offended the gods. The second version of this curse story is that Tantalus stole the nectar and the ambrosia of the gods. Nectar and ambrosia, by the way, are the drink and food of the gods, and they symbolize or represent the gods' immortality for some reason. I'm not sure why. And there's this idea that if a human can steal or get a hold of this divine ambrosia and eat it, then they will become a deathless god. And so the idea is that Tantalus was trying to steal immortality. So whichever story you accept, the curse that Tantalus brings about has to do with a human being overstepping his bounds and transgressing the gods. And so Tantalus is punished in the underworld through being inflicted with eternal hunger and thirst. He must stand forever in a river of water that is up to his chin, with fruit trees visible on the bank of the river just out of reach, which is awful. And he can't drink the water or eat the fruit, so that is his punishment. He is subject to be eternally hungry and eternally thirsty, eternally tantalized by what he desires. This is where this is where our word tantalized comes from, Tantalus. So this curse continues to Pelops. Pelops reiterates the curse by behaving badly himself, and so you can see how this is an intergenerational curse that leads up to the point where our story begins. Pelops continues this curse. He sabotaged a race he was involved in. This was a race for the hand of a woman. He was involved in a competition. And he messed with the chariot of his opponent, and then he murdered the charioteer who helped him. Atreus and Thyestes, Pelops' children, not only receive that curse from their father and grandfather, but they too carry this curse into the future where our story begins, and they bring adultery into the mix. So we're kind of just going generation by generation with this curse so that you have some kind of background and context for the Oresteia. And long story short, Thyestes sleeps with Atreus' wife. Remember, Atreus is Thyestes' brother. And all of this was in the midst of a battle, a kind of a Game of Thrones for the kingship, for the rule of Mycenae. Atreus wins the Game of Thrones and becomes king, and he also decides to take revenge on his brother. To do this, he invites his brother Thyestes to a banquet. And guess what the main dish was? Here's some revenge. Atreus killed his brother Thyestes' children, his sons, cooked them, and served them to Thyestes as a dish at the banquet. Thyestes, who was ignorant of what he was eating, ate the flesh of his own sons. He ended up eating his own sons. When Atreus reveals to Thyestes what he has eaten, Thyestes goes into exile and curses Atreus and his descendants. And while he's in exile, Thyestes, on the advice of an oracle, actually fathers a son with his own daughter, and this son ends up being Aegisthus, who will be a very important character in the Oresteia. Thyestes' hope is that Aegisthus, his new son, will avenge his father down the line. So welcome to Greek literature. You have cannibalism, adultery, incest, murder, and revenge. It's all there. So this brings us to Agamemnon and Menelaus, sons of Atreus, and this also brings us to the scene of our story. And this background gives us a sense of the nature of this family curse. Agamemnon and Menelaus must face the adversity of a long generational family curse. So the Oresteia was written in 458 BC, and the whole trilogy consists of 3 linked plays. Agamemnon is the first one, the Libation Bearers is the second one, and the Eumenides is the third one. So let's look at the first and most read book in the Oresteia to start, Agamemnon. This story deals with the return of Agamemnon to his palace after the Trojan War, and his murder by his wife Clytemnestra. Now, despite the title of the play, Agamemnon himself is not on stage for very long. Most of the play deals with the anticipation for Agamemnon's arrival and then the aftermath of his murder by his wife. Now, the play starts out with a prologue, and And at the outset here, a watchman for the city of Argos, also known as Mycenae, recognizes the fire signal indicating that Troy has finally fallen and that Agamemnon will therefore be headed home soon. The fire signal is like a beacon relay that Clytemnestra, who is the queen of Argos and the wife, obviously, of Agamemnon, she has set this up so that she'll know when the war is ended and when her husband will be coming home. The chorus in this play is made up of the men of Argos who are too old to sail to Troy and who know well the history of the house of Atreus so that they can give us context. They briefly recount the story of the Trojan War at the start here and all its fateful relations. So for an in-depth look and an explanation of those events, you should go back again to episode 2 of this podcast. So Agamemnon is coming home. Clytemnestra, his wife, however, is far from joyful at the news. She's been nursing a grudge for many years since Agamemnon sacrificed their daughter, Iphigenia, at the start of the Trojan War. And this is an important thing that we should talk about. This was 10 years prior, and he did this. He sacrificed his daughter. He killed his daughter in order to satisfy the god Artemis, who wouldn't let Agamemnon and his army cross the Aegean Sea. They were trapped by winds on the shores of Aulis on the island of Euboea. So Agamemnon, instructed by the seer Calchas, had to kill his daughter, the most precious thing in the world to him. The tale of that killing is told at the outset of this play, the Agamemnon, in the opening choral ode, which is actually the longest ode delivered in any extant Greek play. The chorus describes Agamemnon's agony in excruciating detail as Iphigenia struggles and a gag is shoved in her mouth so that her curses won't ruin the sacrificial rite. The chorus wails, quote, "Her pleading, her shrieking for her father, the girl's short life, these were nothing to the lovers of battle, her judges." So laced throughout this account, I would say, is a spiritual declaration. And I was struck by this passage, which seems to have the flavor of Buddhism or Christianity, and which, you might say, acknowledges the important task of pursuing meaning in a tragic, fallen world. And I'll give you the quote. "Zeus puts us on the road," the chorus wails, "to mindfulness. Zeus decrees we learn by suffering. In the heart is no sleep. There drips instead pain that remembers wounds, and to unwilling minds circumspection comes." To make matters worse, in Agamemnon's absence, Clytemnestra has taken as her lover Agamemnon's cousin, Aegisthus, who wishes to sit on the throne of Argos as ruler. Remember, Aegisthus is the son of Agamemnon's uncle, Thyestes, and Thyestes' own daughter. And remember, it's Aegisthus' job to avenge his father's treatment at the hands of Atreus, who murdered Thyestes' sons and served them at the banquet. So when Agamemnon does return, he brings with him Cassandra, and she's an important character in this play. Cassandra is his concubine and an enslaved Trojan priestess of Apollo, and this obviously further angers Clytemnestra. So Aegisthus, her lover, who was formerly exiled from Argos because of the quarrels between his father and Agamemnon's father, Atreus, he stays hidden while Clytemnestra goes out to greet her husband, who has just returned home, though greet is probably not the best word. Both spouses treat one another coldly and talk past one another, making formal speeches to the chorus. When Clytemnestra finally convinces Agamemnon to enter their home, she urges him to step from his chariot onto a purple-dyed cloth that she has spread. It's a delicate tapestry that Agamemnon doesn't think is right to walk on, but Clytemnestra insists. It may be appropriate to mention here that the dye used to make purple cloth, you may know this from reading about Shakespeare, was made at this time from the secretions of marine snails. So purple was usually an indication of great wealth. So as Agamemnon steps onto the cloth, he brings with him Cassandra, who is, as I mentioned, she's a seer. And also, I forgot to mention, she is a daughter of King Priam. Cassandra, up until this point, is silent, and since she's a foreigner, the audience likely assumes that she is a muta persona, a non-speaking character, which turns out not to be the case. Clytemnestra tells Cassandra that she too is welcome inside the palace. She says, quote, "Come, get yourself inside. That's you, Cassandra. Zeus makes you share our household rights, but not to punish you. Don't be too proud. There's comfort in your owner's ancient wealth." Unquote. The chorus then speaks to Cassandra, offering her a choice. Here you are, tangled in the net of fate. You might perhaps obey her, or you might not. At this point, likely surprising everybody, Cassandra begins to wail in grief and horror. The chorus doesn't comprehend her message, but she continues to declare that destruction will fall upon this place, and she bemoans the fate that destroyed Troy and brought her here in the first place. The chorus prompts her to tell her story. Apparently, and this is her story, the god Apollo fell in love with Cassandra and granted her the gift of prophecy. She promised to bear him a child, but when she broke her word, he punished her by making it so that nobody would heed her warnings. After explaining this story, she prophesies that she and Agamemnon will die at the hands of a woman. This is what she prophesies, a woman lioness who goes to bed with the wolf. And this is obviously Clytemnestra and Aegisthus. I tell you, she howls, you'll see Agamemnon's death. Eventually a son will emerge to kill the murderers and avenge his father's death. So after delivering this prophecy, Cassandra declares that she is resigned to die. I can't evade it any longer, she says. The day has come. I could run, but it wouldn't help. And at this point, Cassandra makes the choice to go into the palace after Clytemnestra. And as we linger outside with the chorus of men, we hear from off stage, that would be inside the palace, we hear Agamemnon shouting, "No! I've been hit! The wound is deep!" The chorus stops to listen, and Clytemnestra swings open the doors and reveals herself standing over two bloody corpses. And the lines she delivers here are quite incredible. Clytemnestra says, quote, "Though all I said before was right for then, I'm not ashamed to state the opposite. How else would someone paying evil back to those disguised as friends raise suffering's net around them to a height they can't leap over?" And here, of course, she's talking about Agamemnon's sacrifice of her daughter Iphigenia. "Right where I struck, I stand on my achievement. I acted, I'm not going to deny it, to trap him so he couldn't fight off death, as if he were a school of fish." And she goes on, "Twice I strike, and a double groan announces his legs collapse. He's fallen, but I add a third, an extra blow. He falls convulsively, gasps out his soul, and spouts a headlong slaughter gush of blood, striking me with dark scarlet showers of dew. And I rejoice, as in wet quickened sowings of Zeus's grace, when buds emerge from labor. Be glad or don't, but triumph fills my heart." Unquote. So, that's pretty amazing stuff right there. Clytemnestra kills her husband with an axe while he is undefended in his bath. We can see that Agamemnon's fortunes have basically taken a 180-degree reversal. He's gone from the pinnacle of heroic fame and accomplishment, of victory in war, in the Trojan War, victory in battle, to the abyss of ruin and an utterly ignominious death. So that's it, and the Queen Clytemnestra insists that her murder has put an end to the cycle of vengeance and violence brought about by this family curse. Here, Clytemnestra's lover, Aegisthus, also comes out and delivers an arrogant speech to the chorus, the elders of Argos, who react angrily to him. And the play closes, it ends. This first play in the trilogy ends with the chorus reminding the usurpers that Agamemnon's son Orestes will surely return to exact vengeance. So that was the Agamemnon. The second play in Aeschylus' trilogy, that would be part 2 of the Oresteia, is called The Libation Bearers, and it deals with the reunion of Agamemnon's children, Electra and Orestes, and also the revenge that they take against their mother Clytemnestra and her lover. The play opens with Orestes at his father's tomb. This takes place several years after the murder of Agamemnon, and at this point the kingdom of Argos is uncertain. A snake, which then feeds from her breast and draws blood along with milk. Pretty gross. The snake is later revealed as representing her son, Orestes. Concerned about the possible wrath of the gods, she orders her daughter Electra, who is basically now a slave girl, and a chorus of other slave women. They're called the libation bearers. She orders them to pour libations on her late husband Agamemnon's grave as an offering to the gods. The chorus, who, as I mentioned, are basically a gaggle of slave women from old wars and who are loyal to Orestes and Electra, these women are very opposed to Clytemnestra and Aegisthus. And their role is to basically, as the chorus, explain the unfolding conspiracy. At her father's grave, Electra sees a lock of hair and some footprints. She follows them and meets her brother Orestes, whom she had been praying would arrive. Orestes, by the way, had been banished from the kingdom when he was little and raised in another household. This is obviously due to Clytemnestra's apt fear that he would one day avenge his father's death. Orestes identifies himself with the snake in his mother's dream, and the two siblings plan to avenge their father by killing their mother and Aegisthus, as Apollo himself has commanded him. I cry, quote, I cry to those who rule below unchallenged. See what is left of Atreus' line, defenseless, despised, and robbed of its home? Zeus, where can we turn? For degrading my father, you will pay at the hands of the spirits, at my own hands. Then I can die when I have cut the life from you. So Orestes and his childhood friend Pylades, who has been quietly by his side throughout the entire story, they come up with a plan to take vengeance against Clytemnestra and her lover. Remember, Aegisthus, her lover, also happens to be Orestes' uncle. So Orestes tells Electra of the plan. He has decided that they will gain entry into the palace by saying that they are messengers. They will pretend to be travelers from Parnassus, and they're there to bring news of Orestes' death. They'll put on fake accents and ask for hospitality at the palace of Argos. And he rightly assumes that for Clytemnestra and Aegisthus, this will be welcome news. They will be happy to know that their only remaining threat is dead. Now, once they have gained entry into the palace, Orestes will kill Aegisthus and he will kill his mother Clytemnestra. So here's Orestes relaying the plan. It's simple. First, Electra will go in, and I entrust her to conceal our pact, so those who lured an honorable man to his death will be lured into that same snare and die. In all my traveling gear, I'll play a stranger arriving at the gates, here with Pylades, this foreign guest and ally of the house. We'll both speak the Parnassus dialect. I'll mimic how the Phocian language sounds. So once the two make their way to the palace, they will bring the false news that Orestes is dead, which will help them get into the palace, where they will then seek to get Aegisthus alone and stab him to death. So Orestes' plan does work. As Orestes and Pylades arrive at the palace door and are able to meet with Clytemnestra, they remember to bring the grim tidings that the son and heir of Atreus, Orestes, is dead. He perished abroad. That's what happened. After Clytemnestra welcomes them into the house, Orestes' old nurse is then dispatched to get Aegisthus, to fetch Aegisthus so that he can see the visitors as well. Now, before doing this, Aegisthus asks the chorus about Orestes. Just like in the first play of this trilogy, the Agamemnon, when the violence goes down, we're stuck with the chorus as Aegisthus goes to see the strangers. In a short time, we again hear a scream of agony. This time, it's Aegisthus. And here is a clip from a BBC Three production of the Libation Bearers.
Travellers, I'm Aegisthus, and this is my house. Travellers? Are you asleep already? Did my wife give you no candles? Travellers? Please, friends, step into the light.
Zeus, we pray one last time. The moment is here. Let Orestes' blade deliver justice. Whose death did we just hear? Whose house are we now in?
Shush, shush, shush. Play dumb. Do nothing till we know. Our job is done. Fate has struck.
So you can see that Orestes easily overpowers and kills Aegisthus. One of Aegisthus's men comes out of the palace and tells Clytemnestra this very cryptic message. He is alive and killing the dead. Clytemnestra is a savvy woman. She immediately realizes that this stranger in the house is not, in fact, a stranger, but is her son Orestes, and that Orestes has killed her lover, Aegisthus. She then calls for an axe so that she can kill her son herself. So it's back to the Clytemnestra that we know. But she doesn't quite have a chance to do this, because when Orestes himself comes out and confronts Clytemnestra, when he does this, there's an interesting shift in Clytemnestra's attitude. She suddenly shifts into the innocent feminine role. She begs Orestes to take pity on her by reminding him that she nursed him at her breast when he was her baby. This probably calls to mind for readers a very famous passage from Homer's Iliad when the aged Hecuba, queen of Troy, exposes her breasts to her son Hector and begs him not to go outside and fight Achilles. So this reassertion of Clytemnestra's motherly role and her call for pity almost works and does cause Orestes to hesitate, though only momentarily. When he does hesitate, it's never easy to kill your mother. Pylades, his friend, Pylades reminds Orestes that he must kill Clytemnestra. Interestingly, these lines, the lines that Pylades speaks to Orestes, are the only lines that Pylades speaks in the entire play. And he utters the following lines. He says, "What then becomes thereafter of the oracles declared by Apollo? What of sworn oaths? Call all men hateful to you rather than the gods." Orestes then comes to his senses. He seizes his mother Clytemnestra and he kills her. The chorus replies, "For these two I make my lament, but seeing poor Orestes reach the summit of murders, I would rather have it this way than for the house, its eyes put out, to fall." So here's another short clip of this scene. I should say that the BBC Three version does change and reinterpret the original play. They change the words. So just know this is an inexact adaptation of the play that is mostly meant as entertainment. So here you go.
Of course, trickery collects the debt I owe it. At least I have a blade. Fate is not yet decided. Orestes!
Do you recognise me now? And here? Do you recognise your lover?
Oh, what have you done? What have you done to my Aegisthus?
I left his legs where he stood. Pylades kept his tongue. And his chest I brought for you. And the rest of him I'm wearing. So you won't forget me twice.
Oh, no. No.
You'll have the same, mother. I'm gonna climb back inside you.
Orestes, I love you. You have no idea of the love I have for you. Kill me if you must, but I know you. This barbarity is just a poison you have drunk to quiet your nerves. You once drank my milk. It was pure love I fed you. I poured my life into you. A love that humbled me. It is still sacred. You know this. My son. Don't damn yourself. Put down your blade.
Pylades, I can't. How can I kill her? She's my mother. Is the sin too dreadful?
My friend, shame is nothing. The word of God is everything. Do it now.
No! No, please!
Mother, gather your lover together so you can be butchered with him.
I gave you life!
You killed my father!
I was acting for fate!
It acts on you now.
Think of the furies this will unleash!
Your crime brought me to this. Foulness demands foulness. Sin demands sin.
You're about to kill your mother, my darling!
So that was gruesome and rather liberal on the sound effects. So, okay, after this murder, Orestes proclaims that justice has been served, and he tries to justify his actions. He says, "Be my witness, if I'm ever tried. It was right to seek the penalty of death for her. Aegisthus's death is simply the law, since he debauched somebody's wife. She plotted hatefully." Orestes laments, "I've lost the fight. The terror in my heart is poised to sing and dance to Fury's music. While I'm still sane, though, I affirm to friends in public that I justly killed my mother. Filth the gods hate, assassin of my father." But the chorus replies, quote, "No, you did right. Don't let such noxious words escape your mouth. Don't take yourself to task. You gave the Argives back their city's freedom by deftly cutting off 2 serpents' heads." Unquote. But then at this point, the Furies appear, and they are visible only to Orestes. The Furies, I should say, by the way, were 3 goddesses of vengeance and retribution who punished men for crimes against the natural order. They were particularly concerned with homicide, any unfilial conduct, offenses against the gods, and perjury. So a victim seeking justice could call down the curse of the Furies upon any criminal. And the most powerful of these offenses was the curse of a parent upon the child. For the Furies were spawned of just such a crime. So the Furies appear, and only Orestes can see them. And they curse him at the end of this play for killing his mother. And for them, killing one's mother is a crime far more significant than the crime that Clytemnestra committed in killing her husband. So the question here is one of justice. Who is more guilty? Clytemnestra or Orestes? Was Orestes right in taking the life of his mother and her lover? Was he right in taking justice into his own hands? So seized at this point with a madness over his deeds, a confusion and a madness, and being haunted and pursued by these Furies here at the end of this play, Orestes flees Argos. So now I want to move rather quickly through the final play in the trilogy. It is called the Eumenides. Eumenides means kindly ones, and it refers to the chorus of ancient female deities that dominate the final drama of the play. It's important to note that these goddesses are not called the Eumenides anywhere in the final play. They're instead called the Erinyes, or the Furies, which I mentioned before. They are goddesses of blood vengeance. The Furies, to say a little bit more about them, are considered primeval beings linked both to the earth and the underworld. So their job is to oversee obligations of various kinds, oaths in particular. And as such, they have the power to basically torment anyone who breaks these sacred oaths. And the most important oath, and I don't think anyone would disagree with this, the most important violation here, according to this tradition, is the killing of a family member, especially the killing of a family member who gave you life. So the Eumenides tells of how Orestes is pursued to Athens by the vengeful Furies for the murder of his own mother, Clytemnestra, and how he is tried before Athena and a jury of Athenians to decide whether his crime justifies the torment of the Furies. So I'll try to give a brief summary of this as well, and I'll keep it short so that we don't run out of time. At the end of the libation bearers, that would be play 2 in the trilogy, remember, Orestes sees the Furies pursuing him. Also note that only he can see them, and he runs away from them in terror. This flight from the Furies leads to a months-long exile in which Orestes, who is pursued everywhere he goes by the Furies, he goes out there and seeks purification. He wishes to be cleansed of his blood guilt, and so he goes to shrines throughout Greece. And then he finally goes to the most sacred shrine of all, the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. Now, as the play begins at the Temple of Delphi, we're thrown into a drama dominated by gods and primal forces. The killing of Clytemnestra, it seems, has brought 2 generations of gods into a clash of competing philosophies, really. And here to give you a sense of the situation here, I'll quote the introduction to the version of the play that I read, which is translated by Sarah Rudin. Quote, Apollo claims to represent the will of Zeus, his father, who decreed that Clytemnestra should die as the just penalty for her murder of Agamemnon. The Furies align themselves with an older order, Earth, and the primal forces linked to her, that pays no heed to such abstractions as divine justice, unquote. The Furies refer contemptuously to the Olympians as younger gods, and they invoke the ancient principle that blood will have blood, referring to the fact that the slaying of one's kin must be punished by death. This is the general basis of the philosophical disagreement that I mentioned. So here, Athena, the goddess of wisdom, law, justice, etc., Athena is tasked with adjudicating this dispute, but she feels that the task is too daunting for her alone, and so she decides to install a panel of Athenian citizens to help decide Orestes' case. She impanels a jury of 12 Athenian citizens to judge Orestes and his alleged wrongdoing. And she, Athena, who is, again, the goddess of justice herself, she is going to preside over the trial. Here I want to step back and talk about what Aeschylus is really trying to do here. Aeschylus uses this myth of family murder and family vengeance as a way really to talk about and comment on systems of justice. So one of the things the Oresteia is about is the difference between a system of justice in which reparations for murder are dealt with through individual blood vengeance, as had been the case for millennia, blood vengeance and revenge undertaken by the family of the victims, and on the other hand, a system more like the system that we're used to, a system of court justice in which, as a society, we rightfully hand over the responsibility of justice and retribution and punishment to a court system or a legal body, and we let the courts take care of the matter for us. So I want to play a short clip by the classics professor Elizabeth Vandiver. She does a nice job of putting this issue that Aeschylus is examining into perspective, the way that Aeschylus is really trying to complicate this long-standing system of blood vengeance. Here she is.
In Aeschylus's hands, the myth of the house of Atreus becomes a means not just to examine individual responsibility, as I've been talking about so far, but also to look at systems of justice and why it is that a court system is better, works better than a system of individual justice. In the Homeric poems, in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and supposedly, or at least presumably, in archaic Greek society as well, justice was an individual matter. Families took justice into their own hands. If I killed my neighbor, the neighbor's family would kill me. Then my family would kill the neighbors, and so on and so on. It's an open-ended system, but it works pretty well as long as people don't mind it being an open-ended system, and as long as murderer and victim are not members of the same family. But this system of private blood vengeance breaks down in Orestes. It's a system that cannot accommodate someone for whom both the murderer and the murder victim are members of his family. Aeschylus hones in on that to show the difficulties of a system of private vengeance, because this is the one time when it simply cannot work. Orestes' dilemma is insoluble. under the traditional system of individual justice, the system that is reflected in all the myths that we know of. All the myths of Greek culture assume individual blood vengeance. Aeschylus, however, takes one of those myths and uses it to examine the value of a court system, which is a really extraordinarily brilliant thing to do with such a myth. Orestes' dilemma can only be solved through the invention of a system of public justice, a new system of justice in which the duty of exacting vengeance is taken away from the individual's family members and handed over to society at large. In other words, it can only be solved by the inauguration of a court system. And that's what Aeschylus shows us in the third play of the trilogy.
So Athena's move here represents supposedly the first time any such jury has been convened. What we're witnessing will be a template for the future. It is the foundation of a jury trial system, which gives ordinary mortals the power to determine facts, to use their reason, and to distinguish right from wrong. And I want to read another quote for you. This too is from the Sarah Rudin introduction to the play. She writes, quote, Athens, by 458 BC, had gone further than any other Greek city toward radical, for its time, democratic government, in part by creating a vast jury system employing thousands of citizens. Athenians, who watched this play in the theater of Dionysus, beheld, among other things, the elevation to mythic dimensions of their own political evolution. Unquote. So the Athenian citizens in this play are given essentially a mythological origin story for their celebrated democratic system of justice. But on the other hand, it's clear that the playwright, Aeschylus, is showing that although the system of justice is a clear marker of social progress, these systems must be refined and improved, and this first instance of justice and diffusion of power doesn't actually go well in this play, in the Eumenides. So back to the play. Orestes here in this play becomes the first ever defendant on a murder charge in the first ever court, in the first ever trial ever held. So this is really the first courtroom drama in Western literature. During this trial, Apollo is tasked with speaking on behalf of Orestes, while the Furies, as I mentioned, act as advocates for the dead Clytemnestra, because they seek to enact vengeance or justice for Orestes' crime of killing his own mother. After both sides, that would be Apollo and the Furies, after they make their case on each side, when the trial votes are counted, the jury reaches an impasse. The votes, it turns out, are actually tied. This acquits Orestes. This is what happens at the end of the play. Orestes is acquitted. He is not convicted. And so with this acquittal, the curse on the house of Atreus is actually lifted. Orestes, at this point, leaves to live a normal life. And this trial also, many scholars would argue, brings to an end what I called earlier the Age of Heroes. What about the Furies? To appease the Furies who are not at all happy that Orestes was acquitted, they are appointed by Athena to be henceforth kindly guardian spirits, protectors of Athens. They are now given a new job to placate them, which is why the play is called the Eumenides, because the Furies are now given the job of being kindly guardian, protector spirits for the city of Athens. So they go from being spirits who enact blood vengeance to being kindly guardians of Athens. This is done by Athena for the benefit of these angry Furies so that they don't feel they've been completely deprived of their powers through this courtroom decision, which clearly does undermine their power. They are essentially placated and given a new but important role. They will now be honored by the citizens of Athens, and Athena declares that henceforth hung juries, and this is a new rule that's established, should always result in the defendant being acquitted, as mercy should always take precedence over harshness, which seems to be close to the notion that we assume individuals are innocent until we can definitively prove them guilty, so hung juries should result in acquittal. As the play ends, the women attending Athena sing praises to Zeus and Destiny, who have brought this marvelous arrangement to pass. And we have reached the end of our play, and I don't want to run out of time, but before I finish up this summary of the Oresteia, I want to say that here Aeschylus is doing something quite clever with this trilogy, if you think about it. He is using the current court system of his own time, and in a way, as he writes this play, he is back reading the Athenian system of justice into mythic time, and in a sense giving this system of justice both a foundation in myth and a kind of dignity and a history that would bestow nobility upon it and would simultaneously please the people of Athens. And that's pretty clever. Okay, I want to briefly talk about another play that actually channels and appropriates Aeschylus's Oresteia trilogy, and that is one that many people don't know about, and that's Jean-Paul Sartre's 1943 play The Flies, in French, Les Mouches. So again, The Flies is an adaptation of the Electra myth, and Sartre really revamps the story of Orestes and creates his own kind of existential take of the drama by adding Zeus as a kind of ironic, despicable character and adding a plague of large flies. They're people who suffer from constant fear and a lack of autonomy, and these are people who live in constant shame of their humanity. In Sartre's version, what Orestes finds when he returns to Argos is that every citizen of Argos has been consumed with guilt over the murder of King Agamemnon. They spend all day mourning, repenting, wailing, beating themselves up, and they are living basically in a state of misery. King Aegisthus and Queen Clytemnestra are also consumed with shame and have imposed repentance on their people. So that's really the background of the play. There is this atmosphere of moral guilt and people living in shame. Sartre's play has 3 acts, which obviously corresponds to the fact that the Oresteia is a trilogy. So I would say that the play really gets existential and really interesting in Act 2, which goes along with Aeschylus's The Suppliant Maidens. So just as in Aeschylus's play, Orestes and Electra here in Sartre's play unite, and they resolve to kill Aegisthus and Clytemnestra. But Zeus in this play first visits Aegisthus to tell him of Orestes' plan and to convince him to stop it. Here Zeus reveals 2 secrets of the gods. Number 1, people are free. And number 2, once they're free and realize it, the gods cannot touch them. The gods cannot intervene in people's lives. Life and choices then become a matter that men deal with amongst themselves as free individuals. So that's the big secret. Aegisthus doesn't want the people of Argos to realize this fact, and the annual ceremony of the dead and this fable that goes along with it has enabled Aegisthus to keep control and order over the city, instilling fear and guilt among the people. The idea in this story is that by killing Aegisthus and Clytemnestra, Orestes takes on the remorse of the people and frees them from their guilt. That is the didactic existential lesson that Sartre delivers in this play. By making his choice, Orestes exists and creates himself as an individual. So I just want to walk you through the end of this play because the moral lesson really occurs in Act 3. In Act 3, after killing Aegisthus and Clytemnestra, Orestes and Electra flee to the temple of Apollo, just like in the original Oresteia, to escape the men and the Furies, which Sartre also calls the Flies. At the temple, these flies, these Furies, wait for Orestes and Electra to leave the sanctuary so that they can attack and torture them. At this point in the play, Electra starts to fear her brother, and she actually turns. She turns away, and Orestes, for the rest of the play, is going to play the part of the existential hero, where as Sartre sets up Electra as someone who is inauthentic and lacks moral courage. So Electra starts to fear her brother, and she begins to try to avoid her responsibility for the murders of their parents. She attempts to evade guilt and responsibility by claiming that she had only dreamt of murder for 15 years, and that was just a form of release. She didn't really mean or want to do it. While Orestes, he is the actual murderer. Orestes tries to keep her from listening to the Furies, who are trying to convince her to repent and accept whatever punishment will be doled out for her actions. Keep in mind that Sartre's representation of the Furies differs from that of Aeschylus, in that instead of attempting to avenge the crimes committed, what they do is try to evoke guilt from those who commit moral sins. For Sartre, the Furies serve as a mechanism for him to talk about the way really that society, the herd, the group, applies pressure on the individual to conform to their standards and their norms. Sartre in this play makes the case that remorse is important, but it should only be felt if one believes that the act they committed is wrong. By acting in what he believes to be a righteous way and killing the king and queen, his mother and stepfather, Orestes is the existential hero because he does do the right thing. He is a hero who takes responsibility for his actions without feeling any remorse for them. Zeus attempts to convince Orestes to atone for his crime in this play, but Orestes says he can't atone for something that isn't a crime to him, that isn't a moral crime. Zeus then tells Electra that he has come to save them and will gladly forgive their actions and give them the throne if they repent. Orestes is not willing to do this. Orestes refuses the throne, and he refuses the belongings of the man he killed. Orestes feels that he has saved the city by removing the veil from their eyes, sort of like the allegory of the cave, and exposing them to freedom for the first time. But Zeus says the town people hate him, and they're waiting to kill him. And at this point in the play, in Act 3, Orestes feels alone. The scene at the Temple of Apollo in Sartre's play really represents a decision between God's law and self-law. In other words, the autonomy of the individual to pursue ends that he himself deems to be morally righteous versus following some dogma from above. But Orestes refuses to repudiate his actions. So in response, Zeus tells Orestes of how, look, he himself has ordered the universe and nature based on goodness, and that by rejecting this goodness, by rejecting this determinism, Orestes is rejecting the universe itself. So Orestes still is determined to be free. He accepts his exile from nature. He says, I don't care, Zeus. I will do what's right, even if it exiles me from nature, even if it exiles me from the rest of humanity. So Orestes makes the argument that Zeus is not the king of man, and that he blundered when he gave men freedom, because once they realize that they're free, they cease to be under God's power. Orestes announces that he will free the townspeople from their remorse, and he will take on their guilt and sin. So this is clearly a reference to Christ. Here, Orestes becomes Nietzsche's Übermensch by showing the townspeople his power to overcome pity and phony guilt. These ideas come mainly from works like Thus Spoke Zarathustra, in which the highest virtue is portrayed as the ability to free one's mind from dogma and to exist as an individual free from the impressions of others, and instead to think on a higher moral level. Like Zarathustra, Orestes in this play feels that he must go down at this point to the people and open their eyes. When debating Zeus, Orestes talks about being beyond the common slave morality of the people, which is also an idea clearly influenced by Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. Orestes is not bound by the false dichotomy of good and evil, but he, like Camus' existential hero in The Stranger, Meursault, he accepts what he's done, choosing to focus on the present and on the future. Electra, in the end, proves to be no such hero. Electra chases after Zeus and promises him her repentance. Don't punish me, Zeus, So Electra is not an existential hero. And so when Electra repudiates her crime, Orestes says that she is bringing guilt on herself, and that guilt results from the failure to accept responsibility for one's actions as a product of one's freedom. Instead, Electra, Orestes argues, is accepting the inauthentic values that Zeus imposes on her. In repudiating the murders of Clytemnestra and Aegisthus, Electra allows Zeus to basically determine her past for her. She surrenders her freedom by letting her past take on a meaning that she herself didn't give to it. And as a result, she becomes bound to a meaning that someone else determines for her. And this is against the existentialist creed. As the play closes, Orestes informs the citizens of Argos that he has taken their crimes upon himself and that they must learn to build a new life for themselves, free from remorse, free from guilt, free from shame. He wishes to be a king without a kingdom, and at this point he promises to leave, taking their sins, their dead, and their flies with him. And at the end of the play, Orestes walks off into the light as the Furies chase after him. So you'll notice the primary emphasis among the existentialists, who, by the way, they were all Marxists and some of them were socialists, and there were a few Christian existentialists, but this was a radical philosophical movement that actually did exist on the left wing. And I do want to point out, interestingly enough, this was back in a time, the existential movement that existed somewhere between the late 19th century and the mid 20th century. Existentialism was a movement about responsibility. The primary things that Sartre talked about were freedom, responsibility, independence, being an authentic person. I would say that this is a very different form of radical politics than the left-wing practices today, as postmodernism sort of succeeded Sartre in dominating university thought. Lastly, I do want to mention some of the historical context here. Sartre was obviously a famous philosopher, and he really was the foremost advocate, the creator, the father, you might say, of the philosophy of existentialism. He was the one to really coin the term and apply it to his philosophy in his famous speech, "Existentialism is a Humanism." Sartre, at the time of World War II, was actively involved in the French opposition movement called the Resistance, and part of that resistance involved artistic and philosophical expressions that criticized the politics surrounding the events that were taking place. In this atmosphere at this time, the problem was that Sartre couldn't publish anything that attacked Nazi rule directly because the censors wouldn't allow it. So like several other authors of this period, Sartre chose a Greek play to give him kind of a cover for his anti-fascist message. So The Flies is actually, it's a commentary on many levels. It's a great story on the one hand, but it also happens to be an expression of the philosophy of existentialism, but it's also a criticism of a fascist ideology. And he had to kind of dress it up as a kind of adaptation of the Oresteia so that the censors, so that the fascists, so that the Nazis wouldn't see the message underneath. And the censors, morons that they were, did indeed miss the message of the play, and they allowed him to put it on. But the audiences picked it up instantly. And when you read the play now, given what we know about history, the criticism seems obvious if you read into it a little bit. Think about it. The conditions in Argos, as Sartre describes them, closely mirror the state of affairs in France. Aegisthus murders the true king of Argos and takes his place, while the queen, Clytemnestra, gladly joins him and supports his every repressive action. It's clear that Aegisthus then allegorically stands for the German occupation, while Clytemnestra represents the collaborationist Vichy government. So for Sartre, this play was meant to be a call to the French people to recognize their freedom to act and to rise up against their oppressors. It was a call to action. In the play, the people of Argos represent, and Sartre actually said this, and I'll quote him, so the people of Argos were supposed to represent, quote, the old collective power that is enslaved and propagandized. Although Aegisthus is ultimately responsible for creating rituals and repressive religious customs that keep the populace focused on their sinfulness instead of embracing their freedom and power, the people themselves willingly cower within this miserable comfort zone. In 1941, Sartre and his longtime partner Simone de Beauvoir attended performances of a production of The Suppliant Maidens, and this is actually how Sartre got the idea to recast the Suppliant Maidens and indeed the larger trilogy, the Oresteia, as an existential tale and as a tale of resistance. And so here's a quote from Sartre's biographer. It was during this production of the Suppliant Maidens that Sartre conceived the idea of writing a play himself. He was inspired by questions of freedom, authenticity, and moral responsibility, as France at that time was occupied by the Nazi Party. One scholar has explained the relationship between the flies and Sartre's philosophy this way, quote, "The play explores the key existentialist themes of freedom and responsibility through the radical conversion of Philebus, the peace-loving intellectual, into Orestes, the warrior. A person may not be prepared for present crises by his past experiences, but it is nonetheless bad faith for him to declare, 'I was not meant for this,' or 'this shouldn't be happening to me.' Orestes resists bad faith and achieves authenticity by rising to the demands of his circumstances and by fully realizing his being in situation," unquote. And so that is a quote by a scholar who was doing a literary criticism of this play. I will say, to wrap this up, that the scholar did mention being in situation. Being in situation is basically... this is a term that came out of Heidegger and was adopted by Sartre. Being in situation is basically accepting responsibility for the situation that you're in as an individual and operating as a person with agency in the world. So these philosophers thought, even though our existence is contingent and there is much that we cannot control, the existentialist hero, according to thinkers like Sartre and Heidegger, the existentialist hero is someone who accepts their facticity, meaning the elements in one's immediate situation that they cannot control, and takes responsibility for the things that are actually happening in their own life and in the environment around them, acting with courage and agency. In contrast, and this is what Electra suffers from, being for others occurs when human beings accept morals thrust onto them by others without examining them critically. So here the individual is not existing authentically as their own being, but is attempting to influence, maintain, and conform to the imagined perceptions of others, basically living in and through how you perceive others to be viewing you. Our thoughts, actions, and purpose in life are entirely reliant on how we imagine others are perceiving us and how they might feel about us. And for the existentialists, this was inauthentic. This resulted in inauthentic identity construction, low self-esteem, loss of self, lack of autonomy, loss of freedom. So all in all, this is what Electra falls prey to and what Orestes rejects as Sartre's existential hero. Okay, so that was fun, revisiting a play that I haven't read since college. And I think it just goes to show how vivid and influential these Greek stories have been throughout time, even for the existentialists who were interested in the present and their own radical philosophy, and who certainly were not followers of the moral norms of the Greeks, and who certainly did not believe in, many of them didn't believe in God. They found a rich platform through the Oresteia to tell their own story and to embed their own moral lesson. So I thought that would be interesting to share with you. So I want to end episode 5 by sharing with you an article that I wrote for a prominent outlet. The opportunity to write this piece came from a guest that I had on this podcast in an earlier episode. He is actually an editor at this outlet that I won't mention the name of. He emailed me and asked if I would write a piece about why it is important to teach the Western canon. And he also wanted me to talk about what it was like to be a teacher in this day and age who still unapologetically goes to bat for the Western canon. Now, I've written for a couple of fairly prominent outlets in the past, but this was a really golden opportunity, I felt. So the article I submitted was not published, at my request, actually. So here's the long story made short. What I'm about to read to you is what I sent in to this outlet. The editor, this was the guy I had on the show, liked what I wrote and was excited to publish it, but he wanted me to make some changes. He wanted me to cut out the beginning commentary, the first 3 paragraphs that I'll read to you, and he wanted me to expand the latter portion of my piece, the part where I go into some detail about kind of an icky experience that I had at a department meeting at the school where I formerly worked, not the school that I work at now. I initially considered doing what he asked, and because I really wanted to tell this story, and I certainly wanted to pen an article for this outlet. But the editor, and he's a great guy, by the way, the editor wanted me to reveal more details that I was uncomfortable revealing. He wanted me to reveal more than I wanted to reveal about a professional meeting that we had, and I just wasn't willing to go into that kind of detail, and that was kind of what he wanted because he thought my account was vivid. He loved the descriptions and wanted me to kind of psychoanalyze the attitudes that my colleagues hold and that many public school teachers hold. He wanted me to reveal more of what was said at that meeting, and he wanted me to unpack my colleagues' motivations and deconstruct their claims in a way that I felt uncomfortable doing. I have a lot of respect for my former colleagues, and I was just generally uncomfortable with that idea. So in the article I'm about to read to you, I said as much about that as I was comfortable doing, and so ultimately I had to decline the editor's offer to publish the piece. And I'll read it to you now because I still feel that it's a good piece, and I thought I'd save it for the podcast. This is a piece called "A Public School Teacher Doubles Down on the Western Canon." Enjoy. As the baby boomers retire in droves, we're getting a first glimpse of what it will look like when the ethos of the campus left takes hold of secondary education. The resentful chant, which has been growing steadily louder on campus since the 1960s, is now being taken up by high school teachers and administrators. Hey ho, it roars, Western Civ has got to go. As a public school English teacher in a progressive area, I find myself nearly alone in my enthusiastic support of teaching the Western canon, as I swim daily against an educational tide that seeks to drown students in identity politics, moral relativity, and a proud Philistinism spawned by pop culture and mainstream media groupthink. The premise of school as a positive right for all is simple. No matter what happens at home, and despite a growing anti-intellectualism in the public sphere, we teachers are granted 50 minutes a day, 5 days a week, to capture students' attention, develop their cognitive faculties, and expose them to culture, that civilizing force Matthew Arnold defined as the best that has been thought and known in the world. This is the teacher's sacred responsibility. In a very real sense, then, the civic health of our nation, though presently addled, has long rested on the deliberate transmission of a set of core stories, ideas, and values that typify the West and form what perennial educators once called the great conversation of history. But what happens when teachers themselves become willfully ignorant of this conversation? What happens when the words of Homer, Dante, Shakespeare, Tolstoy, and the Bible come to be regarded not as profound expressions of our common humanity, but as tools of Eurocentric chauvinism and patriarchal oppression? At a recent department meeting, this is precisely how my colleagues argued the Western tradition should be viewed. The topic of discussion was our outdated curriculum. It was unacceptable, my colleagues complained, that our curriculum was dominated by, quote, dead white males. Given demographic changes in our district, one teacher argued, we should remove non-progressive authors from the curriculum to make way for new authors who represent the racial identities of our students. Yes, another chimed in, quote, the curriculum should be inclusive. Students need to see themselves in the text, unquote. The teachers in the room, all left-leaning women, 76% of U.S. public school teachers are women, were no longer raising their hands but shouting. These books are outdated, one teacher cried. Quote, we're turning our students into a bunch of conformists, unquote. Murmurs and nods of assent swept through the room. The discussion went on like this for several minutes, and I wondered, would none of my colleagues stand up for the Western literary tradition? Here was my cue. I told my colleagues I didn't agree with the idea that students must, quote, see themselves in the text. The point of great literature, I said, is not to reaffirm students' narrow experiences of the world, nor is it to validate their cultural identities, whatever those may be. The books we teach our students should instead work to liberate them from shallow identity markers and social determinants. The purpose of a liberal arts education has always been to free the student, as Robert Hutchins puts it, from the, quote, prison house of his class, race, time, place, background, family, and, paradoxically, even his nation. The job of the Western educator is to break up tribes and create individuals who will contribute to the common good in their stead. To the extent that we wish for students to, quote, see themselves, unless we're suggesting that young people be regarded as mere exemplars of their race, gender, or ethnicity, an idea that is antithetical to the West, then we must teach books that explore deep human truths and timeless universal themes, works that prompt students to examine big ideas, ask hard moral questions, and challenge the unreflective assumptions of mainstream culture. My colleagues, needless to say, were not impressed. Not one person at the meeting agreed with me. They argued that students could get the things I mentioned from practically any grade-level book. Let them read The Hunger Games. Why does it have to be Shakespeare or whatever? Asked a special education teacher flippantly. As the meeting drew to a close, the cacophony of dissenting voices was enough to drown out any possibility of a rebuttal on my part. Our curriculum, one final teacher said, makes it look like we're training our students to impress a bunch of white people at a cocktail party. Driving home from work, it occurred to me that only someone who hasn't read Shakespeare would ask, why Shakespeare? The notion that Shakespeare is taught so that students can win friends and climb ladders, the cultural capital argument, does nothing but beg the question, and fails to say anything substantive about Shakespeare's work and the impact it can have on a student's inner life and powers of expression. An appeal to Shakespeare's race, gender, or cultural relevance as a factor in determining whether he ought to be taught ignores his unparalleled mastery of the English language, his brilliant irony and subtle humor, his deep insight into the human condition, and, perhaps most importantly for educators, it ignores the stunning complexity of his plots and characters, a fact that rewards rereadings and delivers near endless interpretations. And still, I tried to take the problem my colleagues raised seriously. The question of why this author or that strikes to the heart of why we have a literary canon in the first place. How do we decide which works merit inclusion in our canon? There are, of course, political and nationalistic answers, yet for the most part, canons are formed by teachers who read texts closely and must take seriously Harold Bloom's laconic maxim, "He who reads must choose." That there is only so much time means that the educator's great responsibility is to select works that inculcate the proper values, both aesthetic and humanistic, that will lead to the cultivation of the higher faculties, among which are judgment, taste, and civic virtue, that collection of qualities Cicero called humanitas. A proper school, writes theologian John Henry Newman, trains the intellect to, quote, reason well in all matters, to reach out towards truth, and to grasp it. Will teaching the autobiography of Malcolm X, as I was once required, help my students to cultivate humanitas? Will teaching the Hunger Games, as many districts now do, train students' intellects? For Harold Bloom, the question of what to read largely comes down to aesthetic originality. If our students are to develop humanitas, then they must be liberated, at least while they're in school, from the aesthetic vacuity of youth culture. It is not the teacher's job, contrary to the now fashionable social constructivist notion, to pander to students' interests or cultures. As a teacher, it is my job instead to rescue my students from the hackneyed cliches and empty pronouncements that plague mainstream popular culture, and to deliver them to a place of depth and originality. In my classes, students must grapple with the great conversation of the Western intellectual tradition. They must also master fundamental skills in grammar, classical rhetoric, and logic, so that they can apply these critical skills to 21st century tasks, problems, and modalities. Although I do not have complete control over my curriculum, I will expose my students to the ideas and stories that matter, even if I have to close my door to do it. So that's it for this episode, episode 5 of the Western Canon podcast. I want to thank Edith Hall for being a guest on the program. Next episode will be focused on Euripides, and our special guests will include Diane Arnson-Sfarlian and Spencer Clavin. Thanks for listening, and happy reading.